Welcome to my channel, ketomealsandrecipes.com. In today's video tutorial, I will not only share my recipe, but most importantly, I will show you the technique I use to make an absolutely perfect Keto Flaky pie crust. And as with all my recipes, is gluten-free. And you don't need any special equipment like a food processor to make this recipe. In this video, I will also show you how to blind bake this crust to a perfect light golden, which you can then use for a no-bake pie filling. The macronutrient ratio for this entire pie crust is 4.8 to 1, with 28.5 grams of total carbs, 9.5 grams of soluble fiber, 10.3 grams of insoluble fiber, resulting in only 8.7 grams of net carbs for this entire pie shell. However, if you're wondering the carbs per slice, the macronutrient ratio is actually the same, 4.8 to 1. But this time, it's only 3.6 grams of total carbs, 1.2 grams of soluble fiber, 1.3 grams of insoluble fiber, resulting in 1.1 gram of net carbs per slice if you're cutting your pie into 8. In this video, I will be using basic keto ingredients you most likely already have in your pantry. The first thing I do is gather and weigh all of my ingredients. And then I preheat my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 180 degrees Celsius. I also put a parchment lining just on the bottom of my pie pan. Now let's get started. To begin with, I'm using a large mixing bowl to which I'm going to add all of my dry ingredients. The almond flour. I still can't find my fine mesh sieve, so I'm going to use my hand whisk to break up any large clumps of almond flour. Next, drop in the whey protein isolate. I'm using unflavored, but you could use a vanilla flavored whey protein. Now I'm going to add the sweetener, which I grind to a fine confectioner powder. In all of my recipes, I prefer to use a monk fruit erythritol blend because non-keto people don't detect much of a difference from regular sugar. Sprinkle in your gluten-free baking powder. And then add your glucomannan, which is also known as konjac root powder. I use this ingredient because it is a natural plant-based binding agent, which helps to sort of bind everything together the way that gluten would in flour. And lastly, add your finely ground salt. I'm using Himalayan salt because it has a nice mild taste. Get your hand whisk and stir the dry ingredients. You keep doing this until all the ingredients are well combined. And this also aerates the dry ingredients. It's really important that for this recipe you use a completely frozen, unsalted butter, not room temperature and not melted. Then get your box grater and rotate it so that you're going to be using the largest holes on the grater. Then simply grate about 1/3 of the quantity of frozen butter directly into the bowl with the dry ingredients. In order to be able to accurately determine how much of my butter I have already grated, I always place my bowl on my scale, which I've taired before starting. In this way, I know my measurements are exact. Then after grating the first third of my butter, then using my fingers, I toss to coat the butter. Doing this will prevent your butter from clumping and sticking together in one big lump. And the other benefit of doing a third at a time, doing this also helps the butter to more evenly distribute throughout the dry ingredients. Then repeat the grating and tossing until you have grated and tossed all the butter that you need. I know that many people like to use a food processor to do this step, but I have found that using a food processor results in a much denser and not as flaky pie crust. So I prefer and highly recommend you use your fingers instead of a food processor to incorporate the butter with the dry ingredients. And this step is very easy. Take a small handful of the mixture and with gentle pressure, roll your thumb over the mixture. As you do this, the mixture will come together and form a dough. Keep doing this rolling technique until all the dry ingredients and the butter have formed into a large crumb texture. This step shouldn't take very long, but in case your butter starts getting a little bit warmer and you're noticing that it's getting too soft, just put the bowl into the freezer for 3 to 5 minutes. The secret to a flaky crust is the frozen butter. And now I'm all done, and you can see how large the crumb mixture looks. You don't need to get any finer than that. And another really nice thing about this recipe is you don't need to form the dough into a sheet. Just get your bowl and spread the crumbs as evenly as possible over the entire bottom and along the sides of the parchment-lined pie pan. There are many reasons I really like this crust. First and foremost, it tastes amazing. It tastes like a regular pie crust. 2, it doesn't use cheese. And 3, and most important to me, and you don't need to use highly processed ingredients such as vital wheat protein. I'm going to blind bake the crust in a metal pie pan, but you could use a glass or ceramic one. However, you will have to adjust the time. To compress these crumbs into a nice dough, you can either use the bottom of a small container like a measuring cup or a glass to press down. However, I find it much easier if I use my fingers to gently press down on the crumbs. In this way, I have much better control over how much I compact the dough. And because you're using your fingers, you'll also notice where the texture is too thick or too thin, and you can level off the dough as you're pressing. Then do the same for the sides and the top edge of the dough. Because I like my pies to look really nice, I like to even out the top edge of the crust by using my knife. As you're going around the top edge of your pie, you may notice that some areas have too much dough and others not enough. So you can borrow from the areas that have too much to fill in the areas that need a little bit more dough. But before putting the pie in the oven, first I'm going to use a skewer to poke holes all over the bottom and sides of my pie crust. Making these holes in the dough will prevent the crust from forming large air pockets and bubbling the bottom or sides to form an uneven crust. As I said, I'm not using any special equipment. However, alternatively, you can use ceramic baking beads or even dry kidney beans to keep the bottom from puckering as the crust is baking. And the last thing I do before baking is to put my crust into the freezer for 15 minutes. Chilling the dough will prevent the crust from shrinking too much as you bake. Now it's time to blind bake, meaning baking an empty pie crust. So place your pan into the middle position of your preheated oven and bake for 10 to 12 minutes to a light golden if you're going to do a second bake when you add the filling. Or bake for 15 to 20 minutes to a little bit deeper golden if you're preparing the crust to use for a no-bake pie. When the timer goes off, immediately remove the pie crust from the oven, set your pan on the counter or cooling rack, and let it cool completely to room temperature before adding the filling. Now, if you're wondering what to do with this pie crust, I hope you come back and watch my next video where I will be using this pie crust for a very special holiday pie. And I've already made this and tested it with friends and family. And I'm sure, just like my test subject, everyone will enjoy it, whether they are keto, gluten-free, sugar-free, or just partake in a regular diet. Thank you very much for supporting my efforts by watching my video. Please leave me a comment and tell me what pie is your favorite. The link for the written formatted recipe, which can be translated into many international languages, as well as other important links, are in the description box. I hope you enjoyed this recipe, and until next time, have a wonderful day. Cheers!